the sequel to Turn of the Screw?
It's the influence of television. Now, Marshall McLuhan deals with it in terms of it being a high intensity, you understand? A hot medium.
What I wouldn't give for a large sock with horse manure in it.
Which he uses essentially
What do
linear.
you do when you get stuck on a movie line with a guy like this behind you?
Wait a minute, why can't I give my opinion? It's a free country.
He can give you. Do you have to give it so loud? I mean, aren't you ashamed to pontificate like that? And the funny part of it is, Marshall McLuhan, you don't know anything about Marshall McLuhan's work.
Really? I happen to teach a class at Columbia called TV, Media, and Culture. So I think that my insights into Mr. McLuhan, well, have a great deal of validity.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
Well, that's funny because I happen to have Mr. McLuhan right here. So yeah, just let me come over here a second.
Oh,
Tell him.
I heard what you were saying. You know nothing of my work. You mean my whole fallacy is wrong. How you ever got to teach a course in anything is totally amazing.
Boy, if life were only like this.
The age of electronic communications begins in the late 1840s with the first telegraph system, which was followed by the telephone in the 1880s, radio and motion pictures in the 1920s, television in the 1950s, and the computer internet or web in the 1990s. The one major theorist of how the new media have affected human behavior over that century and a half is Marshall McLuhan. The term mass media was already in use, and there was already great speculation about the mass media's grip on contemporary life. But once McLuhan lit up the sky in 1964 with his book Understanding Media, the term became his term, which was simply the media, and all discussion of the subject began with whether you agreed or disagreed with Marshall McLuhan. It's remained that way ever since. His ideas are as hotly debated today with the coming of the internet as they were in the 1960s when he became an academic star famous enough for a director like Woody Allen to want to put him into a movie. McLuhan's theory rests on a radical premise. He insists that nothing people can use electronic media for, no message that anyone, no matter how powerful or persuasive, can deliver, even begins to compare with what the new media have done to mankind neurologically and temperamentally. They have directly affected the human central nervous system and changed patterns of thought and behavior. In short, they have literally altered human nature. And there you have the basis of McLuhan's most widely quoted dictum, the medium is the message. The messages, the information transmitted via the new media were beside the point, compared to the way the electronic nature of the media has transformed human life. He believed that people raised after the advent of television have a different balance of the five senses from those raised during the preceding 4 centuries of a print-dominated world. They're more like primitive tribesmen, intimately involved with one another whether they like it or not, and captives of what they hear over the grapevine whether it's true or not. But this new electric tribe is worldwide and its grapevine is instantaneous, hence McLuhan's famous phrase to describe the late 20th century, the global village. Today, on the eve of the 21st century, with hot speculation about a coming digital civilization in which all humanity will be wired up and online so that geographic locations and national boundaries, or so it's predicted, will become irrelevant, McLuhan is very much in the center of the screen again, nearly 2 decades after his death, this time as the first seer of cyberspace. Marshall McLuhan, his full name was Herbert Marshall McLuhan, was born in Edmonton, Canada in 1911 and raised in a typical Scotch-Irish frame house with wooden obelisk half columns holding up the roof of the front porch. His father's forebears were Scotch-Irish farmers in Western Canada, and his father himself, Herbert McLuhan, was an insurance salesman. But his mother, Elsie Hall McLuhan, was another story. She was the cosmopolitan, a cultivated Easterner from the maritime provinces, English in background, well-educated, an elocutionist by training, a flamboyant figure in theater circles who toured Canada giving dramatic readings. Despite her many absences, it was she who ruled the family, and it was she who steered both Marshall and his younger brother Maurice toward intellectual careers. Maurice, known around the house as Red, eventually became a Presbyterian minister. The McLuhans lived modestly, but Elsie McLuhan would make sure in due course that her son Marshall, the academic star, was educated abroad. While he was still a boy, the family moved to Winnipeg, and he went to high school and college there, graduating from the University of Manitoba, which was about a mile from his house, with a bachelor's degree in 1932 and a master's degree in English literature in 1933. But his mother had grander credentials in mind. At her prodding, he applied for and won a scholarship to Cambridge University in England. At this point, McLuhan was very much the traditional young scholar, the literary man, a type he would later ridicule as smugly ignorant of the very nature of the medium he studied and labored in, namely print. As it turned out, in the 1930s, the literary life in Cambridge, at Oxford, and in London was anything but traditional. This was the trough of the Great Depression, and British intellectuals had begun to take an interest in the lower orders, in the masses, many as Marxists, but others as students of what would later be called popular culture. McLuhan was drawn to the work of Wyndham Lewis and the Cambridge scholar F.R. Levis, who were treating movies, radio, advertisements, and even comic strips as a new language. These were also the palmy days of Catholic writers such as Hilary Belloc and G.K. Chesterton, whose wit and sophistication had suddenly made Catholicism exciting, even smart, in literary circles. Two of the most brilliant and seemingly cynical of the London literati, W.H. Auden and Evelyn Waugh, converted to Catholicism at this period. And McLuhan also became a convert to Catholicism and to the study of popular culture. Although almost nothing in McLuhan's writing was to be overtly religious, these two passions eventually dovetailed to create McLuhanism. After receiving a second bachelor's degree from Cambridge, he began his teaching career in 1936 in the United States at the University of Wisconsin. He returned to Cambridge in 1939 and over the next 3 years received a master's degree and a doctorate in English literature. After Wisconsin, he taught only in Catholic institutions, first the University of St. Louis, then at Assumption University in Windsor, Ontario, and finally at the Catholic College of the University of Toronto, St. Michael's, where he joined the faculty in 1946. By this time, Marshall McLuhan was 35 years old and the very embodiment of Elsie McLuhan's appetite for things intellectual and for the center of the stage. He was known both as a literary scholar, an expert in 16th and 17th century English literature and the work of James Joyce, and as a charismatic figure who captivated groups of students and faculty with his extracurricular Socratic gatherings devoted to the folklore of industrial man, as he called it, in which he would decode what he saw as the hidden language of advertisements, comic strips, and the press. For example, he'd show a slide of a Bayer aspirin ad, which featured a drum majorette wearing a military helmet and jack boots and carrying a baton about the size of a mace. The caption reads, "In 13.9 seconds, a drum majorette can twirl a baton 25 times, but in only 2 seconds, Bayer aspirin is ready to work." What's the true language of such an ad, he would ask? What does it really convey? Why, a goose-stepping combination of military mechanism and jack-booted eroticism, he would say, the wedding of sex and technology, a recurring advertising theme that he christened The Mechanical Bride. That was the title of his first book, published in 1951 when he was 40 years old. The Mechanical Bride had the conventional anti-business bias of the literary man, aimed as it was at liberating the public from the manipulations of the advertising industry. But it also led McLuhan into the orbit of his colleague at Toronto, the economic historian Harold Innis. As McLuhan himself was quick to point out, it was from 2 books published by Innis in 1950 and 1951, Empire and Communications and The Bias of Communication, that he drew the central concept of McLuhanism, namely that any great new medium of communication alters the entire outlook of the people who use it. Innis insisted that it was print, introduced in the 15th century by Johann Gutenberg, that had caused the spread of nationalism as opposed to tribalism over the next 400 years. McLuhan's first major theoretical work, the Gutenberg Galaxy, published in 1962, when he was 51 years old, was pretty much an elaboration of Innis's insight. His masterstroke came 2 years later when he brought the Innis approach forward into the 20th century and into the age of television with Understanding Media. He theorized that print had stepped up the visual sense of Western man at the expense of his other senses, which in turn led to many forms of specialization and fragmentation, from bureaucracy, the modern army and nationalistic wars, to schizophrenia, peptic ulcers, the cult of childhood, which he regarded as fragmentation by age, and pornography, the fragmentation of sex from love. In the second half of the 20th century, enter television. Television, said McLuhan, reverses the process and returns man's five senses to their pre-print, pre-literate tribal balance. The auditory and tactile senses come back into play, and man begins to use all of his senses again in a unified, seamless web of experience. Television, McLuhan maintained, is not a visual medium, but audio-tactile. This was the sort of contrary utterance he delighted in making, contradicting common sense without trying to explain or waiting to debate. In any case, the world was fast becoming a global village, that being the end result of television's seamless web spreading over the earth. The immediate effects of television on the central nervous system, said McLuhan, may be seen among today's young, the first television generation. The so-called generation gap, as he diagnosed it, was not ideological but neurological, the disparity between a print-bred generation and its audio-tactile, neo-tribal offspring. McLuhan, in fact, was observing the new generation up close. In the summer of 1939, he had been in California visiting his mother, who was teaching at the Pasadena Playhouse, when he met an American actress, Corinne Lewis, fell in love with her, proposed to her, and then, right then and there, he married her on the spot, and he took her off to Cambridge, all in such short order that she had to wire her parents to let them know she was now Mrs. McLuhan. Marshall and Corinne McLuhan had 6 children, 4 daughters and 2 sons. Personally, McLuhan had little patience with television or any other electronic medium. But he looked on with awe as his children seemed to study for school, watch television, talk on the telephone, listen to the radio, and play phonograph records all at the same time. The new generation, he was convinced, was bound to sit baffled and bored in classrooms run by print-bound teachers. This meant that the educational system must be totally changed. But then the new sensory balance was going to bring about total change, and he used a capital T and a capital C in any event. Just as the wheel was an extension of the human foot, and the axe was an extension of the arm, the electric media were extensions of the human central nervous system, and these nervous systems would be brought together in an irresistible way. Human nature would now be different. Nationalism, the product of print, would become impossible. Instead, there would be the global village. It would no longer be possible to insulate racial groups from one another. Instead, all would be irrevocably involved and responsible for one another. McLuhan warned that the global village was not a prescription for utopia. In fact, it might just as easily turn out to be a bloodbath. After all, where do we find the most accomplished butchers, he asked at one point? In villages. The global village could bring all humanity together for slaughter as easily as anything else. Yet he also believed that the new age offered the possibility of something far more sublime than utopia, which is, after all, a secular concept. The Christian concept of the mystical body, McLuhan wrote in one of the few explicit references he makes to this dream of his, of all men as members of the body of Christ, this becomes technologically a fact under electronic conditions. And here we see the shadow of an intriguing figure who influenced McLuhan every bit as much as Harold Innis, but to whom he never referred, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhard de Chardin was a French geologist and paleontologist who had first made a name for himself through fossil hunting expeditions in China and Central Asia. At the age of 30 in 1911, the year it so happens McLuhan was born, he became a Jesuit priest and taught geology at the Catholic Institute in Paris. His mission in life, however, became to take Darwin's theory of biological evolution, which had so severely shaken Christian belief, and show that biological evolution was merely the first step in God's grander design for the evolution of man. God was directing in this very moment, the 20th century, the evolution of man into a noosphere. That was Teilhard de Chardin's coinage, a noosphere, a unification of all human nervous systems, all human souls through technology. He mentions radio, television, and computers specifically and in considerable detail, and talks about cybernetics. His powers of prediction were astonishing. He died in 1955 when television had only recently come into widespread use and the microchip had not even been invented. Computers were huge machines that were not yet in assembly line production. But he was already writing about the extraordinary network of radio and television communication which already links us all in a sort of etherized human consciousness, and of those astonishing electronic computers which enhance the speed of thought and pave the way for a revolution in the sphere of research. This technology was creating a nervous system for humanity, he wrote, a single, organized, unbroken membrane over the earth, a stupendous thinking machine. The age of civilizations has ended, and that of one civilization, and he underlined one civilization, is beginning. That unbroken membrane, that noosphere, was of course McLuhan's seamless web of experience, and that one civilization was McLuhan's global village. We may think, wrote Teilhard, that these technologies are artificial and completely external to our bodies, but in fact they are part of the natural and profound evolution of our nervous systems. We may think that we are only amusing ourselves by using them, or only developing our commerce, or only spreading ideas. In reality, we are quite simply continuing on a higher plane, by other means, the uninterrupted work of biological evolution. Or to put it another way, the medium is the message. Now, privately, McLuhan acknowledged his tremendous debt to Teilhard de Chardin. Publicly, he never did. And why? For fear it would undercut his own reputation for originality? That would have been very much out of character. After all, he not only acknowledged his debt to Harold Innis, but even went so far as to call his first book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, quote, a footnote of explanation to his work. The more likely reason is that within Catholic intellectual circles, and we have to remember that McLuhan was on the faculty of the University of Toronto's Catholic College, St. Michael's, Teilhard Chardin was under a cloud of heterodoxy. Decades earlier, the Church had forbade him from teaching or publishing his theory of evolution, since he accepted most of Darwinism as truth. None of his 6 books on the subject was published in his lifetime. But among intellectuals at St. Mike's, as they called St. Michael's College, there was a lively underground, a kind of Jesuit samizdat in Teilhard de Chardin manuscripts, especially after he moved to the United States in 1951. McLuhan was fascinated by Teilhard, but Teilhard presented a problem. Even in death, he remained out of the bounds of Catholic theology, and McLuhan took his faith very seriously, all the more so because he was a convert from Protestantism teaching in a major Catholic institution. But Teilhard presented a secular problem as well. McLuhan was living in an age in which academic work with even a tinge of religion was not going to be taken seriously. Inside the Church, Teilhard may have been considered too much of a Darwinian scientist, but outside the Church, he was considered too much of a Catholic mystic. When Understanding Media was published in 1964, it was loaded with Teilhard de Chardin, but it would have taken another Teilhard enthusiast to detect it, and a rather subtle one at that. Not a single theological note was struck. Indeed, Understanding Media exploded upon the intellectual world in the mid-1960s with a distinctly earthly brilliance, and immediately caught the attention of many of the most devoutly materialistic and practical minds in commerce and industry. In part, it was the deceptively simple title, Understanding Media, which came across as a challenge. You people who use the media, who own the media, who invest millions in the media and depend on the media, you don't begin to understand the media. By late 1964, corporations such as General Electric and IBM were inviting McLuhan to the United States to talk to their executives. Their attitude was not so much he's right, as what if he is right? We'd better find out. McLuhan informed General Electric that they might think they were in the business of making light bulbs, but in fact they were in the business of moving information, every bit as much as AT&T. Electric light was pure information, a medium without a message. IBM he somewhat condescendingly praised for having finally realized that they were not in the business of manufacturing equipment, but of processing information. He excelled at telling powerful and supposedly knowledgeable people they didn't have the foggiest comprehension of their own enterprises. He never adopted a tone of intentional shock, however. He was always the scholar, speaking with utter seriousness. He had a way of pulling his chin down into his neck and looking up out of his long, Scottish, lordly face before he delivered his most Delphic pronouncements. He seemed to exist out and beyond all of them, surveying them from a Sears cosmic plane. But what turned Marshall McLuhan from a University of Toronto English professor with an interesting theory into McLuhan, a name known worldwide, was the curious intervention of a San Francisco advertising man named Howard Gossage. Fascinated by Understanding Media, Gossage took it upon himself, at his own expense, to become McLuhan's herald, bringing him to the United States in 1965 and introducing him to the press and the advertising industry on the West Coast and in New York. It proved to be a brilliant campaign. Magazine articles, newspaper stories, television appearances were generated at an astonishing rate. Late in 1965, both Harper's Magazine and New York Magazine published major pieces about McLuhan. In the single year 1966, the number grew to more than 120 in just about every important publication in the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. The excitement was over the possibility that here might be a man with an insight of Darwinian or Freudian proportions. As his fame grew, so did the ranks of his detractors, particularly among literary people, whom he regularly wrote off as hidebound, reactionary, and oblivious of how even their own medium, print, actually worked. Scientists, meantime, didn't know what to make of McLuhan one way or the other. The heart of his theory, the concept of the human sensory balance, falls within the field of cognitive psychology, or more broadly, neuroscience. Today, neuroscience is the hottest subject in the academic world, but even now, there is no way of determining whether or not any such balance exists, or whether or not a medium such as television can alter one individual's nervous system, let alone an entire society and the course of history. McLuhan treated any and all critics with a rather maddening aloofness. He was not trying to create a self-contained body of theory, he insisted, although in fact he probably was. He was a pioneer, heading out into a vast terra incognita. So little was known, and there was so little time. His mission was to explore, to make the probes, to use one of his favorite words, to open up the territory. Others, those who came after, could conduct the systematic investigations, run the clinical experiments, organize the data, and settle the disputes. He managed to make all opposition sound like what Freud called resistance, a reluctance to let go of the comfortable notions of the past in the face of brilliant new revelations about the nature of the human animal. McLuhan died in 1980 at the age of 69 after a series of strokes which had left him unable to speak, read, or write. He never lived to see the evolution of the computer into a communications medium in the form of the internet or web. Yet he had made reference to the computer, likening it to television as one of the neo-tribal media that demanded pattern recognition rather than the linear and compartmentalized approach of print. No doubt the internet would have delighted him. He would have seen it as a fulfillment of prophecies he had made 30 years before it was born, as a more direct and intimately tribal form of the global village than television, and as an even more likely instrument for the realization of his dream of the mystical unity of all mankind. Here, in a specific, physical, electronic form, was the seamless web of which he had so often spoken. Today, thousands of young internet apostles are familiar with Marshall McLuhan and are convinced that his light shines round about them. From the editors of Wired magazine to the most miserable .com lizards of the chat rooms, they have made him their patron saint. The medium is the message. In what follows, we will see and hear the man himself, Marshall McLuhan, as he attempts to spread his message via the medium that intrigued him most, television.